Greetings, I'm Melinda Negron-Gonzalez, Associate Professor of Political Science at UNH. In this brief video, I'll discuss the war between Russia and Ukraine and focus on the cyber operations that we've seen thus far. Russia and Ukraine, both sides, are lobbying digital attacks against one another, though it's worth noting that Russia is considered one of the world's foremost offensive cyber powers. If that makes you Americans out there nervous, I should also mention that the US is believed to be the most powerful country in the world in terms of cyber capabilities. So let's back up a moment and discuss what cyber attacks are and who carries them out. Cyber attacks attempt to damage computers or information networks through, for example, computer viruses. Some examples of cyber attacks are denial of service attacks. Denial of service attack floods systems, servers, or networks with traffic, and users are then unable to access information systems, devices, or other network resources. Another example is malware attacks. So basically malware breaches a network, and once inside the system, malware can, for example, disrupt certain components and render the system inoperable, or it can block access to key components of the network. So who carries out cyber attacks? Well, nation states, organizations, and even individuals, including so-called hacktivists, those purportedly independent hackers who aim to further a political agenda. So what makes cyber attacks so different from other kinds of attacks against an adversary is that in conventional warfare, attribution is usually pretty straightforward, meaning that you know who attacked you. But in cyberspace, attribution of blame for an attack is pretty complex and can be time-consuming and also costly. And the nature of such attacks allows for plausible deniability by an adversary who may simply claim, hey, it wasn't us. Most cyber attacks cause some level of disruption to service, but contrary to popular belief, cyber instruments are generally not regarded as particularly effective tools of coercion. If a cyber attack causes significant damage, it could be considered an act of war. For instance, if air traffic is disrupted, leading planes to crash and hundreds of people to perish, that might reach the threshold of kinetic damage to be considered an act of war. In times of peace, you don't really see those types of cyber attacks. In times of war, however, states may up the ante and carry out cyber warfare that leads to loss of life, as in the example of shutting down air traffic control. So let's talk about what we're seeing in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Russia, both officially and also through cyber criminals, has a long history of using cyber weapons. But what's interesting is that so far we haven't seen major Russian cyber attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure, as some experts predicted. We have seen that both Russia and Ukraine appear to be focusing a lot more right now on their disinformation war and on conventional war than on cyber attacks that can and probably will change. One theory for why we haven't seen larger scale infrastructure attacks by critical infrastructure attacks by the Russians is that they perhaps don't want to destroy critical infrastructure on territory they plan to occupy, because that can be really expensive to repair, and repairing critical infrastructure often takes time. So that's one theory for why we haven't seen the predicted major attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Ukraine has good cyber defense capabilities, actually, and has been receiving massive assistance from Western powers, corporations, and hacktivists to prevent and respond to Russia's cyber operations. Consequently, Ukraine's cyber defense has actually proved more resilient than the Russians probably anticipated. So Russian hackers' actions against Ukrainians have primarily included attempts to steal information, gain remote access, and use a malicious so-called wiper software to destroy valuable files. The most impactful war-related cyber operations happening right now are probably those focused on intelligence gathering The worst or one of the worst cyber attacks by the Russians knocked offline the internet and cellular service of a major telecommunications company that serves Ukraine's military. And they were offline for the better part of a day. Ukraine blamed Russian hackers for that attack. And basically that cyber attack began in the early hours of February 24th. Which was the first day of the Russian invasion. And the cyber attack began with a distributed denial of service onslaught, really, that knocked a large number of modems offline. And then that was followed by an attack in which a malicious software command was sent across the network, resulting in tens of thousands of modems across Europe becoming inoperable. So that attack caused a major loss in communications in Ukraine during the early hours of Russia's invasion on February 24th. And it also affected users throughout Europe. For example, it knocked off remote access to some wind turbines in Central Europe. More recently, Russia deployed wiper malware to delete data from Ukrainian government agencies. It was largely thwarted, however, because Microsoft actually detected the code and notified Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians updated their virus detection systems to block it. And then the US government requested that Microsoft share that code with other European governments so that they could do the same. And so it's really interesting, this cooperation that we've seen in Europe and among NATO allies with corporations, and you see government to government collaboration as well as business state cooperation as well. Experts do expect an uptick in more visible cyber attacks by Russia sooner than later. Cyber attacks by Russians against Ukraine, but also cyber attacks by Russians against NATO and other European countries. With respect to Russian cyber attacks against the United States, officials have been warning for a while now that American businesses should prepare themselves for Russian retaliation against American sanctions. And so officials in the US believe that energy and financial industries are likely targets. And actually, the FBI already warned 5 US energy companies in mid-March that computers using Russian internet addresses had been scanning their networks. So that suggests that the cyber attacks are coming soon. Potentially, Americans could lose, clean water, electricity, banking services, and the like. However, experts have argued that the likelihood of a successful major attack on US critical infrastructure is actually minimal. And that's because of the US's defensive capabilities. That being said, there is concern that the private sector may be especially vulnerable and not sufficiently prepared for Russian cyber attacks. It's likely that the US is currently engaging in cyber attacks against the Russians. I'm sure of it. I just don't know what those are because they are top secret. And so it's likely that we may not know the full extent of US cyber operations against the Russians for quite some time until that information becomes declassified in the future. So another factor that makes a major cyber attack against US critical infrastructure less likely is Russian fears about the American response and fears about further escalating the tit-for-tat actions between the US and Russia, because the US and Russia would indeed like to avoid World War III. And because there are not yet really well-established rules of engagement, so to speak, in quotation marks, in cyberspace, what some fear is that tit-for-tat cyber attacks could become increasingly severe and not just disruptive, but really dangerous to people's lives and livelihoods, and perhaps cause loss of life, such that Russia or the US would resort to a more physical war in response to a cyber attack. However, what researchers have come to find is that although cyber conflict is becoming more frequent, meaning there are a lot more cyber attacks than there were in the past, that increase is seen more with low-level disruption and of course, cyber espionage than with more destructive forms of cyber warfare. And the data show also that cyber disputes are pretty unlikely to spill over into the physical domains of warfare. And so that portends that we probably won't see such things happening between Russia and the US. But of course, that doesn't mean it can't or won't happen. More severe cyber attacks could, of course, and probably will occur between the Russians and the Ukrainians, who are engaged in an actual hot war, a physical, conventional war. Some have argued that the utility of cyber weapons as a coercive tool of warfare is probably overstated. Contrary to popular belief, cyber instruments haven't been particularly effective tools of coercion, nor have they led to dramatic effects on the battlefield that shift the balance of power. Also, contrary to popular belief, offensive cyber operations are not necessarily cheaper or easier to pull off than other types of offensive tactics, partly because cyber weapons can be difficult to target and control, because computer networks are connected to other computer networks, right? And so, a Russian cyber attack that's aimed at doing serious damage in Ukraine could possibly affect NATO neighbors in a way that brings a wider conflict between Russia and NATO. And of course, Russia would like to avoid that. But all of that being said, cyber weapons are incredibly effective for other types of things like espionage, sabotage, and so on. So in closing, we do expect to see an uptick in Russian cyber attacks against Ukraine, against the US, and against other NATO powers. It's possible that cyber conflict could become more serious in the war between Russia and Ukraine, leading to more disruption, more destruction, and physical effects, including loss of life. It's possible that Russia could be holding back its best cyber weapons for a more critical time in the war because we haven't seen the kind of cyber attacks that some experts predicted. With respect to Russian cyber attacks against the US, President Biden has publicly stated that the US will retaliate for Russian cyber attacks, and the US response will likely include a mix of things the US is already doing, such as sanctions and cyber attacks. What's important for avoiding escalation between the US and Russia specifically is to have really clear public messaging about the digital dimensions of the conflict and what types of actions would cross a cyber red line, so to speak, that could be considered an act of war, warranting a response. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.